Within the United States, we have determined that up to 88% of adults are considered metabolically unhealthy, or as this study quoted, they found that there was an alarmingly low level of metabolic health, even in people who are normal weight, as much as we want to rely on body weight to try to give us an indication of where we're at, where we are at metabolically. As bad as the problem is here, it is substantially worse in Asia, substantially worse in the Middle East. In fact, the most diabetic countries, type 2 diabetic countries on the planet are all in the Middle East. And through the Pacific Islands, Southeast Asia, where I did my postdoctoral fellowship, why is a country like Singapore trying to recruit metabolically minded scientists? Because it's even worse. They have higher levels of type 2 diabetes per capita than we do. But what is metabolic health? There are myriad ways we could define this. I submit that one of the simplest, and indeed there's a consensus around this, ways to define it is based on the metabolic syndrome. You've likely heard of the term metabolic syndrome. It has such a lovely ring to it. And so that term has been adopted and embraced. And it is simply the reflection of this cluster of complications that tend to come together to some degree or another. Someone has too much central obesity, so their waist circumference is a little too big, or their blood pressure is too high, or their blood glucose levels are too high, or their blood triglycerides are too high, or their HDL cholesterol is too low. This, to varying degrees, 3 of the 5, depending on who you're asking, would constitute someone being diagnosed with the metabolic syndrome. Once upon a time, another name for the metabolic syndrome was the insulin resistance syndrome. That was one of its first terms, but that's not quite as lovely sounding. Doesn't attract as much attention, so the name was changed. Now, insulin resistance has a far greater relevance than just these disorders that tend to come together. In fact, virtually every chronic disease is in some way either directly caused by insulin resistance or exacerbated by insulin resistance, including the big killers like heart disease, diabetes, certain forms of cancer, or the most common liver problem, fatty liver disease, infertility. Where the most common forms of infertility in men and women, erectile dysfunction and polycystic ovary syndrome respectively, share this common metabolic core, where insulin resistance is likely either directly causing it or making the problem worse. And then even some that are perhaps among the scariest, like Alzheimer's disease, or painful like migraines, once again have in common with every other problem here, insulin resistance as a root issue. Now, I'm not suggesting that insulin resistance is the only cause of these problems. Please don't misunderstand me. Each of these undoubtedly have distinct, unrelated, noxious stimuli. In other words, an individual cause for that problem that is not shared with any of the others. But the fact that they all do have one thing in common does suggest that as much as we're trying to shoot multiple targets to address all of these diseases, we should at least be spending some of our ammo on the common target that should be the biggest if we're looking at it correctly. In order to understand insulin resistance, let's start at the level of a cell within the body. Now, this could be literally any cell in the body because literally every cell in the body has insulin receptors. Now, I'm a college professor, so I know how kids use the word literal these days. And when I say literally, I'm not using it too liberally. I mean, indeed, every single cell of the body has an insulin receptor, from brain cells to bone cells, lung cells to liver cells, and everyone in between. So insulin will be flowing through our bloodstream, and it will come and knock on the door of a receptor, on one of the receptors on that cell. And a receptor is like a door that is specifically designed for whatever the hormone may be, in this case insulin. So there's an insulin receptor, insulin will come and knock on the door. Now, because every cell has an insulin receptor, what insulin does can vary tremendously. So just to accommodate every cell, I will just say that insulin elicits an action, whatever it may be, and it will differ based on the cell. Insulin's most famous action is to control blood glucose or blood sugar levels. Now, I'm being very deliberate with my language. Not its most important, because insulin does a number of fantastically important things that are more important than controlling blood sugar levels. That is the most famous effect.